Good day, listeners. Welcome to Beyond the Checkbox, where you learn how to integrate more mental wellness into your organization, learning through frontline leaders. Today, we have one of those leaders, Al Visram, who is a psychologist. And I think it's cool to have psychologists on who are like literally on the front lines and practicing. Al has a private practice, works in the community, doing bereavement work with family members who have lost somebody to suicide. Also has a large part of his practice and work where he does coursework and community work in his community. So he's teaching people about mental health first aid, and suicide prevention, all these amazing things. I mean, this is heroes work, working with families who have lost someone to suicide. That's probably some of the most difficult work anyone can do ever, and emotionally taxing and so important and valuable to those families. And we get a little bit of a sneak peek as to what that looks like and what that feels like for Al in working with these patients every single day, working with these clients every single week. So I was really appreciative of this conversation because it gives us a glimpse behind the doors of psychology and mental health. Thank you again for listening, and welcome to Beyond the Checkbox. You are listening to Beyond the Checkbox, a podcast that focuses on leading strategies around bringing more mental well-being into the workplace. My name is Ryan Todd. I'm a psychiatrist and the CEO of Adversity. I'm sitting down with industry-leading change makers to break down their process and see how they are going above and beyond for their workforce mental well-being. Tell me about community-based psychiatry. I was thinking about doing more community-based work, but what kind of, is it a project-to-project thing? Are you doing kind of research and epidemiology across a population? Tell us about that specialty, that field, community-based psychiatry.
Yeah. So just to be clear, so I'm not a psychiatrist.
Psychology. Yeah.
So the community-based work that I do is twofold. One part of it is volunteer work. So doing a lot of mental health education, as well as teaching a lot of mental health first aid courses, within the community, specifically within, my religious community. So that would be the Ismaili Muslim community across Canada. And the second piece of it is I work specifically in suicide bereavement. So I work with clients who have lost someone to suicide, and then kind of guiding them through that bereavement process and things like that.
What, like there's a process there. Like, can you outline? I mean, it's such a devastating loss. It's such a, I was listening to an interview with Eddie Vedder, and he was talking about Chris Cornell, and he said it's a violent act. Eddie Vedder said that, and it is such a violent act and such a loss and tragedy. Where do you start? Like, how do you start that conversation with someone who's in bereavement from a suicide?
Yeah, good question. It's not easy, but I think the best place to start is just acknowledging that losing to someone to suicide is very different than other kinds of losses that people have experienced. Right. So whether they've lost someone due to a medical illness or an accident, something like that, a loss to suicide comes with so many more kind of complexities and so many different layers. And so the first step is really just acknowledging that a loss to suicide is going to be different. And so it comes with this unknown. And so letting people know you might not know how to grieve a loss to suicide, and that's okay. You may have questions about it, and that's okay. You may be feeling a lot of shame and guilt, and we'll talk about that and we'll navigate that, right? But definitely the first step is just kind of normalizing the fact that it is going to be different and something they've probably never experienced before.
Do you do bereavement for non-suicide deaths as well for families?
Yes and no. So specifically in my private practice, I do have people coming in who are, who are experiencing losses outside of suicide bereavement. I wouldn't say that's a specialty of mine, but I do definitely work in that in my private practice, just in a different capacity. So the suicide bereavement is more community-based, with a local nonprofit here in Edmonton. And then in my private practice, I do see loss and grief clients from other areas as well.
What are the big differences? Like I could guess, but like you work with both kind of parties, both extreme loss, suffering. What's the big difference when somebody dies by suicide in the family or a close one?
So, from my experience, one of the biggest differences is somebody who's lost someone to suicide and again, keep in mind this doesn't apply to everybody who's lost someone to suicide, but for I'd say a majority of the individuals that I work with, it's those feelings of kind of shame and guilt, and those feelings of looking at self responsibility. What did I do? What did I not do? Could I have done something else? Should I have done something else? Right. And so those would haves, could haves, should haves are very prevalent when it's a loss to suicide. And when it's another kind of loss or a different kind of loss, there's, well, less of those, and there's more acceptance and more understanding when it's a loss due to illness or an accident or something like that.
It's almost like the locus of control is like if somebody dies in a car accident, like let's say it's difficult to even like, put a hypothetical around it. If I lost a loved one due to a car accident, I would almost feel no guilt about it, I don't think. Like it's out of my hands. As soon as somebody dies in a suicide, you're automatically thinking, yeah, like what was my agency and all that. Are you trying to relieve them of that burden? Understand it? What's the goal there in working with someone who's lost someone to suicide?
Yeah, good question. I think the goal is to increase understanding and then to help navigate the grieving journey. It's really not my role to tell someone whether they do have a role or don't have a role if
Yeah.
in a person who's died by suicide, right? Because every loss is going to be different. I've worked with at this point probably hundreds of clients who are in bereavement from losing someone to suicide, and not one has is the same. And so the context surrounding the loss, the relationships surrounding the loss are all very, very different. And so really the main role is to help with the understanding that bereavement to suicide is going to be different, it's going to be tough, and then help guide in that grieving journey, whatever that looks like. And so some of my clients, relieving themselves of some of that guilt or some of that shame or that self-responsibility, that can definitely be a part of it. But for other clients, it's about making peace with their role and making peace with their responsibility, whatever that is and whatever that looks like.
Yeah, making peace. Like I imagine some people are looking for hope, some people are looking for meaning out of it. Um, like all looking for different things because it's such a complex beast. Do you do similar work in the Ismaili Muslim community with suicide, loss, bereavement counseling?
No, in that community, I mostly do just education. So mental health education. So it's mostly
Okay.
about facilitating mental health first aid courses to members of our communities, to leaders of our communities, to create a mentally healthy community across the country. And so that's been my main role in that community. I mean, suicide is something that impacts our community as well. No community is immune to mental health issues, mental illness, or suicide. But my work doesn't include suicide bereavement in that community.
Do you like? There's a bereavement expert. Her name is Claire Payne out of the University of Toronto, and she said something that I'll forever remember, which is that bereavement's like a brick in your pocket, and you just kind of carry it around, and over time it erodes a bit and gets a little bit lighter, and it never goes away. I'm wondering if you share a similar sentiment with your clients, uh, or is there a point at which I don't want to say this, but like that they can move on or can like put it behind them or turn the page. Like are Do you find that you use similar metaphors, that it is like a long term or almost like a chronic thing?
Mhm. Definitely. So it's a beautiful analogy that you've given there. I'm not too familiar with that individual based out of Toronto, but we do talk about something very similar when it comes to loss and bereavement in general, and that is that it's about growing around your loss. So tying it back to specifically a loss
Mm.
to suicide, it's helping clients recognize and understand that your life is going to be different now that you've experienced this loss, right? So once you recognize that your life is not going to be the same, that you as a human being are different, well, let's explore those differences. Let's explore the changes in your identity, the changes in your value system, the changes in your belief system, and then let's learn to integrate everything else around that, right? And then as we get into the later stages of the grieving journey, however long that takes, and again, we never want to quantify how much time that's going to take. But once people are later on in their grieving journey, it's about recognizing and learning and exploring how do we build our lives around that loss, right? Knowing that that loss is still going to be a part of who we are. And so that brick in your pocket, I like that analogy a lot. And I agree. It's always going to be there. But as we move through that grieving journey, as we navigate that, it gets a little bit lighter.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. How do you deal with it? That's heavy stuff. It's a lot. And you're seeing patients in this kind of mode all day. How do you try and keep your head around it and stay well?
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a couple different ways, but one of the biggest ways is, practicing what we preach as psychologists. One of the biggest things that we that we try and strive to educate our clients on is those coping mechanisms and that self-care, right? And so making sure that I kind of take care of myself in whatever capacity that looks like. So taking time to spend with my family, finding balance in life and in work, recognizing I love talking about boundaries, but recognizing what my boundaries are and when I know when I've done too much and when I need to kind of take a step back and vice versa, recognizing when I may be taking too much of a step back and need to kind of re-engage a little bit more. And so I think practicing all of those different kinds of things are vital ways to maintain that balance and to kind of cope with some of the work that I do.
It must take a special temperament though, or like a endurance. Like I recall doing like in medical school doing palliative care work, and I couldn't do it. It was too, and I had some guilt around it that I couldn't do it because it is a portion of it's still a portion of the work I do. Right, I see people who are dying and family members who are losing a loved one, kind of in the later stages of their life, and it was so just doing that exclusively as a palliative care psychiatrist or physician. I found it to be like too like draining or exhausting, or there's a lot of pressure because it's a huge it is actually the biggest moment, right, of that person's life, and their families all around you. And do you think, I mean, are you trained to build an endurance to it, or is it part of your temperament that can live with the suffering that people are bringing to your clinic every day?
Yeah. I think it's a combination of both. I've never really thought of it like that, but as I hear you talk and as I hear you kind of express that, I have to say for me personally, I think it's a little bit of both. Um, I think a biggest part for me personally, and I can't speak for others in the field. I'm certain a lot of your listeners are probably either psychologists or psychiatrists or in the mental health field as well, and they may have a different take on this. But for me personally, I think it's really about kind of building that sphere of influence around you, and so recognizing, having that self-awareness, to say, what do you get? What value do you get from doing this work? Right. Maintaining those boundaries, but also recognizing that I'm also a human being. And so I definitely have days where I leave my office and I'm like, holy, that was a that was a really hard day, right? And so it's in those moments where I reach out to my sphere of influence, whether it's a consultation team that I'm a part of, or it's one of my supervisors that I can reach out to just to kind of debrief, to consult with, to get a little bit of that validation, and to kind of remind myself that, yeah, I'm either on the right track, or this is what I could have done differently, or just to vent and express in a confidential way how I'm doing, and to kind of check in with myself.
Yeah. 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 Do you ever, like, I imagine it's, like, do you ever get frustrated if somebody's not progressing along that journey? Like, that's a common thing, I think, for an interventionist to want to move someone forward in how we're perceiving that. And people aren't always going to move forward. Do you get frustrated with that?
I when I was studying and doing my master's program, I thought that I might get frustrated with that. I remember talking about that and having conversations about that, and this idea that people always need to be moving forward or always progressing. But now that I've been in private practice for a while and doing all the work that I'm doing, it doesn't frustrate me, because I think it's a part of the human condition, is that to expect everybody to progress in a linear progression all the time, it's not going to happen. And some clients actually need to regress before they can progress, right? And so it's all about kind of, going with the flow, going with the client, and recognizing that everybody's going to move through this process a little bit differently. And for me to dictate what that process looks like for that person would be unfair. So it's about a collaborative approach to say, what does this process look like for you? What do we need to do? And the other piece of this, especially relating back to suicide bereavement, is life happens. And so people are going through these loss and grief journeys, but life doesn't slow down for a lot of these people. They still have, families, they still have jobs, they still have the headaches, they still have the crazy world that we're living in right now with inflation and with all of the stuff that's happening right now, and all of those external pressures coming in on the person. And so it's grieving while managing all of those aspects and all of those pieces.
Yeah, I hadn't even considered that, right? Because it's not like somebody just takes time off. Like, you get a couple weeks off of work. If you have young kids, you get 0 days off. And you have to, and I imagine that's maybe a part of the work you do is to try and keep people afloat during that time. And that's like an outcome that you're trying to achieve, almost, is just to keep going when other people are relying on you for things.
Yeah, you got it. I mean, the example you gave of a parent, I mean, being a parent never ends, right? And so you have a loss to suicide. You're right. Some companies, and not everybody, but some companies, they will give you some time off, some bereavement time. And that'll range depending on how many days and things like that, and how much sick time people have and things like that. But at the end of the day, people do have to get back to their jobs and to their work. And so it is about keeping people alive, or no, sorry, not when I say keeping people alive. What I'm trying to say is keeping people afloat.
Yeah. Sometimes it's keeping people alive too, right? I mean, like,
sometimes it is.
Yeah. Do you measure, like, I struggle with this a lot still, because I'm kind of a simple linear, like, do you consider successes or progress or outcomes? Like, how do you measure, and how do you know that you're doing the right things again? Like, yeah, how do you know that you're doing the right things for that person? Like, how are you measuring the outcomes? And I'm coming at this from a psychiatrist point of view, where so much of what I do clinically is immeasurable. And sometimes I do wish that, like, my wife's a surgeon. Somebody has a thing, they cut it up and sew it up, and then you're good. Like, I sometimes crave that, And how are you measuring outcomes how are you considering progress? Or is that not even the right paradigm to consider this type of work in?
So that it's such a powerful question, because that question has been asked for as long as I've been studying this field, right? Is how do we measure these outcomes? And therapy is something that is so subjective. You gave the example of a surgeon. It is linear and it can be very objective, right? Therapy is very subjective, and it really depends on the impacts it's going to have on each person. It's going to be very, very different. However, having said that, it is very important to look at outcomes and to make sure that we're on the right track and we're doing what's best for our clients. And so one of the methods that we use is what we call the feedback informed therapy model. And this comes from some of the work of somebody named Scott Miller. I think he's based in the US somewhere. I've read some of his work, and the community-based work that I do, we implement a feedback informed therapy model. And so what that looks like is we actually give feedback forms to every single client at the end of the group therapy session, and we ask for some of that feedback. And it's just quick scaling questions with a short text box at the bottom to kind of put in some of that feedback. But the purpose of that is twofold. First of all, it keeps us on track to make sure that we're achieving what we want to achieve and people are getting what they need to. But it also allows us to hear from our clients. And it gives them an opportunity to say, yes, I got what I needed from this session, or no, I did not get what I needed from that session. And it also gives us one opportunity to say, this is what I want from future sessions, so that we can kind of strive and say, okay, this is what this person needs. This is what they're asking for. Let's try and make that possible for them.
It does sort of go against some of the psychodynamic principles of not like sometimes a client maybe this is old or maybe even a patronizing way of looking at therapy, but it assumes that what that person, if they have high satisfaction ratings, then you're going in the right direction, which is maybe not always the case, because you have to poke and prod at things and fester deep psychological wounds, and that doesn't always feel good, or call people out in a way on certain, behavior that's stunting their, progression or growth. So that's an interesting model, is to get their satisfaction on something. And maybe I'm looking at that too simplistically, but I'm wondering how you're thinking about that or considering that part of things.
Yeah, so there's a lot of truth to what you're saying, but I think it depends on the nature of the therapy and the nature of the work. So when we're talking about, suicide bereavement, for example, from what we found is that the feedback informed model works relatively well in terms of the feedback that we receive about our program and about the experience that people have in our program. But when you're talking about, clients from, that have deep rooted traumas, or something else kind of happening for them, then the feedback model may not be appropriate. And you're right, you do have to kind of look at it with a grain of salt and kind of look at it from that larger picture there. But the other piece of it is also empowering that client to recognize that, what do they need to answer? How are they in control of their own therapeutic progression? Right. And so if a client comes in and they're going to, always give us a really, really good rating, and if that's not what's true to them, and they're for whatever reason are just putting that on there, well, our role is to make sure that that client feels safe and comfortable enough and empower them to be genuine and authentic in their responses. And if they're not going to be, well, maybe some one-on-one work might be a little bit more beneficial to kind of call out some of those behaviors or explore some of those behaviors in a little bit of a deeper way.
Yeah, that makes sense. And some of the individuals that I have struggled to work with the most, and maybe it's me, are like engineers who think in a very linear, logical way, and like brilliant minds who I've had the privilege of working with, who've put amazing machines together and processing plants, and if like the constant like check in, how am I doing, how am I progressing, if that's not showing up and the outcome isn't there, then those folks get frustrated too. And so I like that there's an outcome measure, and there's some flexibility in it being subjective. I imagine that is so important, especially in the bereavement work where you're trying to progress that person forward in their life, keep them afloat. And we know that it's not always feasible to just go on the feedback to make it a good therapeutic relationship.
Exactly. And that's kind of that subjective piece of it, right? And it's funny when we're talking about this. I mean, I've had sessions where I leave the session, and I'm talking not about the bereavement work, I'm talking about private practice now, where I've had clients who leave my office and leave the session. And I remember just kind of silently reflecting and being like, wow, I don't think that was a good session. I don't think that client got what they needed at all from that 15-minute session. And the funniest thing, next time they come in, they see me, whether it's a week, 2 weeks, a month away, whatever it is. And they're like, wow, what a powerful session we had last week. And it was the exact opposite of my kind of interpretation of how that session went. And then the exact opposite happens too. I'll have a client leave and I'll be like, wow, I did some really good work there. And then they'll come back and be like, Al, what was that last session? Like, we didn't get to what we needed to do. So it just goes to show that, everybody's so different, and our perceptions of what people need is very different. And so that's where that therapeutic alliance and that therapeutic relationship is really powerful and is vital in creating that safety so that a client can be able to share kind of what they need and what they want. And we can have some of those hard conversations.
Tell me about some of your community work too. I think it's really interesting that it's at least a part of it is focused on the Ismaili Muslim religious community. And the question I'm trying to get to is around stigma. And I feel like it's being dissolved, and I think it really dissolved during COVID because we all felt an element of isolation, bereavement, anxiety during that 2-year shenanigan. Where do you see, and you did some workplace work before, where do you see stigma now? And I'd like your take on that in the context of the community that you do some of this mental health first aid work in.
Yeah. So where I saw stigma, even let's just talk in the last 10 years. So in the last 10 years, like, I've been teaching the mental health first aid course since 2012. So yeah, that is 10 years ago now. So when I first started teaching that course, the stigma was huge. And there was a lot of it, and it was everywhere. The buy-in to get somebody to sit for 2 days to take a 2-day mental health first aid course, it wasn't really there. And I'm talking not only in my community, but also in the workplace.
Sure.
Right. So
yeah.
I'm talking in general here, because I think stigma is not something that's just in one area or one community. From my experiences, I've taught so many diverse people across the country this course now, and the stigma is basically there everywhere. And 10 years ago, buy-in was pretty difficult. I agree with you now. So to answer that question of where is stigma now, I definitely believe it's still there. However, mental health is kind of a buzzword these days, right? It's trendy to talk about. And that has helped us because people are talking about it. And the more people talk about it, the less stigma surrounds it. The more we talk about it, the more people feel safe and comfortable to talk about their own mental health, or to actually access help, or to take that first step in reaching out to someone to get that extra support. So all of that, tying it back to the Ismaili community, we do have stigma in our community. We do have people in our community who don't understand what mental health is or the importance of mental health. However, the opposite is also very true. The fact that we now have a team of mental health first aid instructors across the country teaching courses. So it started with just me back in 2000, and I think we started that initiative in 2014. To now we have a team of instructors that are facilitating across the country, and we've taught thousands of people in our community this course. I think that just goes to show that we're making a lot of progress, and people are wanting to learn. And our courses continue to be full. And we keep on, I get emails all the time being like, when can you teach this course? When can you teach this course? And I have to set some of those boundaries and kind of take a step back sometimes because, well, I'm just one human, right? So I think we made a lot of really good progress, and it's been some truly amazing work that's been going on.
That's congratulations on that. That sounds like an awesome initiative. You have a team going after it now, so that's great. I want to ask you just a quick follow up before we wrap up for the day. You mentioned that you have all this demand for the courses. Stigma is dissolving. Does that make your job easier or harder as a psychologist now that more people are aware of mental health? They're more willing and wanting to reach out. Has it been easier or harder for you?
That's a really good question. I don't know how to answer that, to be honest. I think part of it has been easier in the sense that people are more open to accessing services, and that's always an amazing thing, right? When somebody can reach out and ask for help and take that first step as a psychologist, that's like, I really value when clients do that, because I know how hard it is to kind of take that first step and to be vulnerable and to open up. And so from that aspect, I think it's truly amazing, and it makes our job, well, easier because there's so much more buy-in. But I think the hard part about it is, well, now we have a lot more work to do, right? Because our work is not done. Just because the stigma is starting to dissolve doesn't mean that we can kind of just say, okay, take a break, job well done, let's stay where we are. No, there's still a lot of work that we need to do. And so it's kind of recognizing, okay, what's that next step? How do we access more people? How do we get into the rural communities? How do we make access to mental health education and mental health supports even more accessible, right? And so and those are just a few. That's just the tip of the iceberg of some of the work that still needs to be done.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, hey, I appreciate you doing that work. I know your community does, and especially the work around suicide and bereavement. That is truly heroic work. So yeah, I want to thank you for doing that, and also thank you for spending a little bit of time. I think sessions like this are good for our listeners who are, from employee groups or companies. It also, I always think psychology, it's very like behind a closed, locked door sort of field. It's very black boxed. And when people meet folks like you who are, articulated and energetic and passionate about it and approachable, I think it makes it even easier to reach out and be vulnerable and open up. So thanks for coming on the show today and spending some time with us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're most welcome. I appreciate you reaching out, and I appreciate the time to be here.
Awesome. Thank you. And we'll keep in touch. Absolutely. And we'll be keeping a close eye on the progression of all your mental health first aid work in that community. So appreciate you doing that as well.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for your time today, Al.
No problem. Take care.